Okay, good morning. I am Laura Shaughnessy. I serve as the chair of the Professional Counselor Advisory Committee for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask that the members of the advisory committee respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that's being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. We know Leslie Suister is not here currently. Jessica Allison.
Present.
Good morning.
Morning.
Harriet Buckner.
Here.
Good morning. Michelle Fairbank.
She was not able to be present today. She sent a message.
Okay, thank you. Bob Kircher.
Here.
Good morning.
Morning.
Kenton Olaf.
Here. Good morning.
Good morning. Andrew Secor. Not here yet. And Adil Torres Rivera.
Here.
Good morning. I note the following BSRB staff members also present: David Fye
Here.
and Leslie Allen. Good morning, David and Leslie.
Morning.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at the meeting today, as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we're conducting this meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of KOMA are not suspended, so we'll be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On December 7th, 2021, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of the advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting materials will be posted to the board's website on the day of the meeting. You may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line "Request for the agenda," and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And I did see that Andrew Secor has entered the waiting room, so I'll go ahead and let him into the meeting as well. And I think you're muted, Laura.
Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning.
We just went through the script and we're getting ready to do our first agenda item, which is, excuse me, approval of the minutes from our last meeting. Does anybody have any questions or comments about the meeting minutes from December 6th? I've looked through them and everything looks good. Any questions or feedback? Okay, not hearing anything. I need a motion to approve those minutes.
I move we approve the minutes
Thank
of the
you.
last meeting.
Thank you. I need a second.
Second.
Thank you so much. Anybody who, let's see, all those in favor say aye.
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 Any objections?
I will abstain since I wasn't present at the meeting.
Okay,
I think that's appropriate. So
terrific. Kenton's abstaining.
Kitten, would you like that noted in the minutes, or were you just saying that for the
it
record?
doesn't matter. I was just saying that, whatever is necessary.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, it sounds like they pass. So thank you so much. Okay, the next item, introduction of advisory committee members. Are there people at this meeting that did not get to introduce themselves at the last meeting? I didn't keep track of that. So if anybody wasn't there, I'd like you to speak up and say your name, talk about who you are.
Yeah, I wasn't here in the last meeting. My name is Andrew Secor, and I apologize for not having been present last semester. I had classes where I was teaching during this time. And I am a full-time professor at Mid-American Nazarene in Olathe in their counselor education program. And I've been on the advisory committee now for, I think, 5 years, starting back in 2016. So I do apologize again for my absence last semester, but don't expect to have any of those problems this coming semester.
Terrific. Well, we like having you on here, so I'm so glad you're going to get to be here. I'm kind of amazed anytime we have a meeting that, you know, we can all show up as much as we do, because I know we all have many roles and many commitments. So glad you're here, Andrew.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't here last time either. So I'm Kenton Noloff. I teach counseling at Fort Hays State University. For many years, I was an assistant vice president and oversaw all the student support services there. And then I always wanted to end my career teaching full time, and that opportunity arose 2.5 years ago. So that's what I'm doing now. And I actually go off of this committee. I think it's June, Leslie and David, if I'm correct, because this is my 8th year. So
You're correct. There are 8 years that you can serve on an advisory committee. You can serve up to 4 2-year terms. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, we did all the math a couple of months ago and realized we were getting, you know, close to losing a lot of good people. So that's always a sad time, especially for, I haven't been on the committee for that long either. And the knowledge and the willingness for everyone to share what they know is valuable. So we're so glad when we have tenured people on here. It really means a lot. Hate to think about people rolling off, but we know it has to happen. Anybody else want to say anything or speak about themselves? Okay. So the next thing that we have on our agenda is the executive director's report. David Fye.
So I wanted to go ahead and inform the advisory committee members about a few different items related to the agency, the board, and also some legislative updates. So first, so as of January 4th, most employees of state agencies were directed by the governor to return to working primarily in the office. First, just prior to that time period, there's a lot of remote work that the governor had directed state agencies to follow. So as of January 4th, most of the staff here at the office has been in the office every day. We were authorized to institute a telework pilot in the fall, but when that changed in, I believe, August, when the governor directed most state employees to return to go back to work. So we are back to that pilot, and we have both of our investigators utilizing that under the terms that were approved by the Department of Administration. But otherwise, most everyone is here in the office every day. Another item I wanted to update you all on is we had an open administrative assistant position, and since the last time we met, we have hired a new administrative assistant. Hang on one moment. Sorry about the interruption. We have hired a new administrative assistant. Her name is Tyla Wadsworth, and she's working out really well with the agency. So we're excited to have her. And she'll be doing some of our administrative clerical type work, but also some of our licensing work here in the office. And then recently, our office was closed on Wednesday of last week because of the winter weather, but most of the staff was able to work remotely. So we were still able to do a lot of the functions here, even though people couldn't be in the office. So during the pandemic, we were able to get some technology that allowed us to work remotely. And so we'll continue to use that as necessary. Unfortunately, it may mean the staff receives fewer traditional snow days, but I appreciate all the work that they do. And we'll try to find a way to make it up to them, but we appreciate all the stuff they do and the different accommodations they've made during the pandemic and going to a new way of doing work. So really appreciate that from their part too. In terms of some updates for the board, so at the last advisory committee meeting, I informed you that the board had its annual planning meeting in September, but it had split that between one day, half day over Zoom in September, and then one half day in October. And then at the advisory committee meeting, I informed you that there were several decisions for the board to confirm at the upcoming January board meeting. So I wanted to update you on a couple of the actions that they took at the January board meeting. First is that the board previously had operated at least partially under a document called the board governance policy. And that board governance policy was adopted a long time ago, and it was last updated back in 2011. But there were provisions in there that the board had changed in the way that it operated, and there were some issues and things that needed to be cleaned up in that document. So the board and legal counsel and I worked together to identify some changes to that document. And at the January board meeting, the board did confirm that they changed from that board governance policy to two new documents. The first is an expectation of board members document, and the second is an advisory committee policy. And I'll get into more details about what's in those documents a little bit later today during the training session, because those are incorporated in the overall board member and advisory committee member trainings. Additionally, there was a question that we brought to our legal staff and to the board about, there was a House bill that passed last year, House Bill 2066, that involved expedited timeframes for military members and military personnel and some other individuals. And we were asking for clarification regarding how the requirements on our provisional license work regarding the House Bill 2066 and the provisional licenses. And it was clarified at that meeting that the qualifications for both should be treated as separate. So you can either pursue a path under the terms of House Bill 2066, or you could pursue a path under licensure related to the provisional license requirements, but you can't use those two in combination. That really wasn't the intent, we don't think, of the legislation, and the board clarified that, and legal counsel also clarified that too. So in case there were any questions about that, we sought some clarification and received it from legal counsel and the board at that meeting. In terms of another series of items the board had been looking at, the board had asked advisory committees to report back on the topic of should individuals who have more than one license under the BSRB be able to make their expiration dates all at the same time. And in general, most of the professions weighed in to the board and indicated that they were in favor of allowing that as an option, but not a requirement. So for individuals who would want to just leave them at separate times, either because they wouldn't want the bills to come up all at the same time, or they wouldn't want there to be confusion about the requirements for continuing education between the two different licenses. So we're going to be pursuing some statutory language in the future, looking for some options to give people who have more than one license the ability to modify the dates, but not make it something that would be a requirement for everyone to have the same dates for their licenses. There was also some topics that were discussed by the board. One of those was about records of deceased practitioners, or in cases where the records of a practitioner are abandoned, and how to handle those situations. The BSRB sees those with a little bit of frequency, maybe 1 or 2 times per year. And there's really not a statute in place right now directing the board or on how to handle those. The Attorney General's office does take possession if records are in danger of being out for the public, or someone could get a hold of those records. But in terms of there being a statute under the BSRB, there's currently not one specifically for the BSRB in place. And so the board had looked at a number of different options. There was some support for maybe modifying the regulatory language to add that as a requirement for practitioners, to identify someone who could be the next custodian of their records should something happen unexpectedly and there's not another logical custodian. But in working out the logistics in terms of who would be the person to hold those records, our initial understanding of the Attorney General's office and their authority and what they would seize was a little more limited than what we originally believed. And we didn't want to go ahead and institute a recommendation unless we had the framework in place. So long story short, that is something the board will continue to look at over the course of this year to see if we can come up with a good policy that we can address these issues, but it will take a little bit more time to really work on that topic. In terms of some other updates, I can provide a few legislative updates. Since January started, the legislative session began back on January 10th. The State of the State was given by the governor on January 11th. And legislation was requested on behalf of the board of the BSRB. That is Senate Bill 387. And there is an announcement on the BSRB website about that introduction of that bill, and also a link to the legislative website where people can get information about bill hearings and any action taken on that bill. A real quick summary of the items included in the BSRB bill. Senate Bill 387 includes a social work. I refer to it as kind of a cleanup item In last year's bill that passed the 2021 legislature, House Bill 2208, there were a number of recommendations by the board of the BSRB, one of which involved the number of hours in a clinical practicum for individuals seeking to become a clinically licensed social worker. When that bill was heard in committees, there was an amendment that was added to the bill. That amendment did not come from the BSRB, it came from members of the committee, but the amendment was to strike a specific requirement of 350 hours of direct client contact as part of the requirements of that clinical practicum. The issue is that when that amendment was put onto the bill, it went further than striking just that language. It also struck the continuation of that line, which said, or other postgraduate supervised experience as determined by the board. And previously, what had been allowed was that if someone applied who didn't have a clinical practicum but had an administrative practicum, through rules and regulations, we were able to evaluate those to see if they had met the other requirements to be able to become licensed. But with that language struck, that does no longer will allow us to evaluate other postgraduate supervised experience as determined by the board. So it makes it more restrictive in terms of what we can view and determine if someone meets the qualifications for licensure. And so I don't believe that was the intent. I've spoken with a representative from the Association of Social Workers here in Kansas and clarified, with them what our intent on this is. We're not trying to add back a requirement of a specific number of hours, but we don't believe the original intent of the amendment was to make it more restrictive. This is more of a cleanup provision to add that language back in statute. Once that language is added in, if the legislature does pass the bill, we will still need to go through the rules and regulations process to have it be determined what would be sufficient for someone to qualify under that if they don't have a clinical practicum. But this is the first step in terms of cleaning up that provision. Item 2 is that there's a licensed addiction counselor item. So currently in statute, most individuals with a master's level or higher license under the BSRB are able to use that to be able to test for a licensed master's addiction counselor license, an LMAC. However, we've had some requests from individuals who have wanted to use their qualifications to test for the lower level license, the licensed addiction counselor license. So you would still have the same group of people who were able to test for the master's level, but they would like to test for the lower level, which has a different test and there's different requirements for that examination. And so we don't believe that that would be an issue, and the board was asked to weigh in on that topic, and the board recommended going forward to allow that statutory flexibility to do that. So that's included in the bill. And then the third item is a new requirement, and that would be for the licensed psychology profession, and it would be to require 3 hours of continuing education in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that profession is currently required to obtain 50 hours every license renewal period, which is every 2 years. So within that 50 hours in statute, they are currently required to receive 3 hours of ethics and 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment. This new requirement of 3 hours in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, under this new requirement, they would be able to essentially double count within the existing requirements of ethics and diagnosis and treatment. So if they had an ethics class that also involved diversity, equity, and inclusion, they would be able to take the 3 hours and have it count for both. Or similarly, if they had a diagnosis and treatment series, a class that counted for 3 hours that dealt with diversity, equity, inclusion, that would be able to also satisfy that requirement. All the professions of the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board were asked to weigh in on this topic over the last year, and there was discussion, and what resulted from the conclusion of that discussion was the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee recommended to the board moving forward on that for the licensed psychology profession, and the other professions had the option to do that, but the licensed psychology profession asked to move forward as one profession to make this requirement, and so that is included in the bill as well. The hearing on Senate Bill 387 will be in the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee on Wednesday, February 9th at 8:30 a.m. Any individuals wishing to provide testimony on the bill will need to provide that to the committee assistants by sometime tomorrow. I believe that they usually ask for it about 24 hours before the hearing. So since the hearing is at 8:30 on Wednesday, it would have to be received early tomorrow morning. But that is scheduled for Wednesday at 8:30 in the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. In terms of the other legislative updates, every year the agency is asked to provide a revised budget estimate. And this year we provided that back in September. The division of the budget for the governor's office reviews that and then makes preliminary recommendations. Ultimately, the governor's recommendation is what holds, and that comes out at the beginning of January. Usually it's announced when the governor makes their presentation, or a representative of the governor makes their presentation the day after the state of the state. The governor's recommendation for the BSRB included the same totals that we had originally put into our budget request, so there's no changes. We have gone through the budget hearing on the House side and the House Higher Education Committee last week. There were lots of questions, and ultimately the committee passed it out without any changes. And then this morning at about 9:30, the House Appropriations Committee reported out the budget. The chair did in front of House Appropriations, and House Appropriations have the option to make any further changes, and they did not. So our budget is now past the House Committee. So the next step will be that it is heard on the Senate side and the Senate the Senate Transparency and Ethics Committee, and that will be on Wednesday morning at 9:30. And so that will be one of, I think, 4 budgets heard that day by that committee. So I'll be before that committee to go through our budget, and they're expected to give recommendations that day. And then if they're able to complete recommendations, the plan is for that to be reported out by the chair of that committee to Senate Ways and Means Committee on Friday at 10:30. In terms of any other legislative items, I am monitoring any bills that come through the legislature to see if there's a connection to the BSRB in case the board needs to meet to review those. But so far, there have not been as many bills this year that have had a connection to the BSRB, but I'm continuing to monitor those in case they do come up, and sometimes those are scheduled with very little time before hearings. The only other updates I have there's 2 items I wanted to make you aware of. Recently, I was asked to present information at a conference for the Federation of Associations of Regulatory Boards. That was in Fort Worth, Texas. And they asked me to come and speak at the conference on the topic of public protection through creative access to information. So I went and spoke with them and delivered a presentation to about 150 people, some over Zoom, but most in person. And I think the presentation was very successful. I gave a lot of good information about what the board and the advisory committee have been working on and what information that we put out there for the public. I talked about the information on the board's website. I also talked about our launch of the BSRB YouTube channel last year and our efforts to really get information out there so people can have more information about what work is being done and have the option and the opportunity to kind of weigh in on some of those things too. So really good opportunity, and I got a chance to learn more about what's happening in other states, which is very important for me. I started with the board back in mid-November of 2020, so it's still been a relatively short period of time that I've been with the board. But what I can learn from other agencies, not only here in Kansas, but from other states, is very, very valuable. And we have a number of different processes we're still working on here in the office. So I'm hoping to continue to learn from them. And then if they ask me to share information, I'm very happy to do so. And the last announcement I have is on Friday, I was able to attend day 1 of 2 days for the annual conference of the American Association of State Counseling Boards. Day 2 will be on Friday, February 18th. And the main topic of interest at day 1 of the conference was there was a presentation that involved telehealth and telehealth standards for practitioners. They talked a lot about what different states allow and potentially efforts to have some congruence between what other states are doing and what you can do in certain states, but having clear definitions and clear understanding of what would be allowed or what the acceptable standard is under telehealth practice versus traditional in-person practice. So like I said, the next meeting of that is going to be on Friday, February 18th, and I'll go ahead and report back what I pick up from that day 2 of that meeting. So at that point, I'll go ahead and pause and see if there's any questions on any of the updates that I provided or any other matters.
Well, first, thank you for that summary and for all the hard work that you do. I don't know, you wear so many hats. One question I have, David, is there any reason to think that our budget won't be approved and sent through after the Senate listens about it?
I don't think so. No, one thing in terms of future changes, so there was one item that the governor had proposed as an across the board item, but it would have to be determined by the State Finance Council. So last year, there was an item in the governor's recommendation to give all state employees a 2.5% pay increase. And when the budget was heard last year, there was still a lot of concern about the effects of COVID and the pandemic in relation to the state finances and the ability to fund other operations. So they went ahead and had more of a targeted approach for salary increases for state employees, but they took out the majority of that amount. This year, there is the governor proposed a 5% pay increase for state employees. And part of that is because there hasn't been a pay increase for state employees for the last few years. So that would be one potential adjustment. Usually, in the last few years, the legislature has tried to do an across the board type of handling for agencies, or what they will do is they will target specific entities to have a pay increase, like highway patrol or nurses or some professions like that. So I'm hopeful that they will keep something in for all state employees, because I'd like for my staff to have some additional funds to make up for some of their losses during the pandemic, and also as a way to be able to say thank you for the hard work that they've done this year. So with the exception of that, I have not heard of any adjustments. It's always hard to predict, but I haven't heard of anything that potentially would be a change. I think one thing that helps the committees to know is that we don't, as a fee-funded agency, we don't receive any money from the state general fund. We don't ask the state to give us any money. And in fact, by statute, we contribute back 10% of all revenue we receive. And I believe for the last fiscal year, we gave the state $78,000 based on that statutory requirement. So we receive all the revenue, we have to give back 10%, and then whatever we need for operations comes from either the revenue we receive and then any balance in the fee fund. And so, but I always tell them, we budget for things in terms of legal cost, and if we need experts for hearings and different things like that. But if we don't have to spend that money, we don't. We try to be good stewards of the funding, and the money doesn't go anywhere if we don't spend it. It stays in the fund, and it just means that it'll be that much longer before we have to look at potential fee increases for practitioners.
Terrific. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
I do,
I think
Laura.
Andrew has a hand raised.
David, thank you for sharing about the telehealth meeting that you were at. And I'm curious if there's a way for us to get an idea of what people are proposing, or what in general the idea is behind having that, because I tend to agree. I think that we have no real telehealth regulations. They were never created when they initially were requested from the BSRB. Those regulations were not created after the Telehealth Act was passed, because as I understand it, the people reviewing it at the time felt like what the BSRB had kind of covered that. But I think that was maybe a lack of awareness of the ways in which all the various factors that go into doing telehealth service delivery are different from in-office service delivery. So I'd be curious. One, I'm in favor of more protections for consumers and expectations on providers for what we do via telehealth. But I'm curious, like states such as Georgia, I think, and some other states have some pretty specific requirements and even credentialing, because ethically we're all supposed to be credentialed technically to do telehealth work. But according to the ACA Code of Ethics, we're supposed to be able to communicate our credentials for engaging in that work. And so I'm curious if there are certain states that are pushing this. I know Nebraska, some folks up there have some pretty specific ideas about it. I know Georgia requires the credential through the MBCC, which I think is a bit restrictive in terms of requiring a certain kind of credential to be able to do telehealth. But are certain things being talked about in terms of what this congruency might look like?
Yes. So one thing is, I'm not sure if this actually goes into as a standard or maybe more of a policy, but currently right now, in terms of who can provide telehealth services in different states, we look to where the person is who's receiving that care. And so if someone is physically in the state of Kansas, we say that Kansas has jurisdiction over that individual, and individuals providing care to that person need to be licensed. So they either need to have a license under the BSRB, or they need to, have a temporary out-of-state permit, or for now, for the licensed psychologist, they can get some limited access with SciPac to provide some of those telehealth services. But I think there are situations to where states are seeing, individuals who, may take a short vacation and go somewhere, and there's a question of, can the therapist continue to see them if they're, out of state just briefly? According to most of the rules, no, but some states have opened it up to allow things like that a little bit easier. I think more of what I'm hearing is from some of the states that have opened the doors a lot to telehealth. There are complaints that they have received about, you hear about crazy cases where you might have someone providing services, but in the background, there's someone sleeping behind them, or, kids running around, or someone working with interruptions. Also, you could talk about things like a practitioner trying to provide services, but they have a lot of background noise or a lot of interference. And so it's just a lot of different things to think about than if you're right across the table or in the same room with someone. And so I think part of this is thinking about it in a new way. And also part of it, from public perspective, what should the public understand would be unacceptable behavior? Because there might be people who are receiving services and maybe they think, oh, well, we're all trying to make do at a difficult time, which is true. But if there are things that really go outside of that and are things that should not be acceptable behavior, it would be helpful for them to kind of get some more idea of some of those things too. So I have not heard of one state that is the gold standard in this area, but I'm continuing to listen and hear things. I think the idea is that, if we define it pretty well in one state, the other states can evaluate those terms, see if they're acceptable. One thing I have heard about Kansas is that, for that to be enforceable from us, it would need to be something that would go into probably either the statute or regulation. So I don't know that we could have sort of a best practice advisory document that we would be able to enforce, because we are a creature of statute and regulation. So if we did have something official, it would probably need to be put in officially through the statutes or the regulations.
Can I just follow up to that? Is that okay?
Sure.
Thank you. I haven't been here for a while, so I get to, talk a little bit. Sorry, Bob and Kenton. So the rest of you don't know me as well yet, but so I know that some of the travel piece can be a challenge, because I have supervisees that may go out of town, and then their license in Kansas, have people they see in Kansas. But then I have them contact the state board, Texas being one of those, and you're not allowed to practice from Texas in their state, even if you're licensed in Kansas, because it's both where the client is and also where you are. And so there are various entities, jurisdictions where you cannot practice, even though you're licensed in the state and the physical location of the person is in the state you're licensed in. It's still considered practicing without a license in the other state. In other states like Colorado give you 30 days or so where you can practice without having a license initially. And like there's some southern states that have like snowbird kind of laws where because people are traveling, they live somewhere else for part of the year, they can practice. So I see that getting that kind of understood would be helpful. I tell you, my main concern, because I learned very early on taking over this role, is that this board is not about making things easy for us as professionals. It's about how we protect the public from the actions of those of us that are the professionals. And I do get concerned that with how fast telehealth opened up, without a lack of standard or even in a regulation for what people are supposed to do, that who knows how many people are practicing telehealth in a way that's not considered professionally appropriate, haven't even been trained beyond maybe a 3-hour ethics course maybe in it. And there's a big difference between looking at telehealth as a separate way of rendering a service and a separate modality of providing counseling services altogether, and with different ways of engaging and even applying therapeutic approaches in an online environment. So I think that there are a variety of things that the BSRB somebody is going to have to look at to catch up to how fast this kind of got away, I think, from us with the pandemic, to make sure that we are setting a standard for people engaging in telehealth practice to prevent harm to the public. So.
Yeah, and I think just one comment I'll add on that is I think with the 7 different professions of the board, I think it would be helpful for us to kind of have as much as possible, some uniformity from the board on this topics, and as opposed to, I know in a lot of cases we have the advisory committees weigh in on separate topics, but in really thinking through this, and I think it would make sense for us to have a uniform, as much as possible, policy for the professions in dealing with telehealth too.
Yeah, Andrew, and well, everybody, and David. My thought is, my cardiologist told me that when I was doing telehealth with him, we had to adjust Kenton in 3 months, which what would have taken us 7 years probably if we didn't do that. So I'm wondering, David, if people are looking at other medical professions to see how they're doing things and the things that they have in place. I don't know. And if that would be beneficial for us, I don't know,
I think this also ties into the issue of portability of your license across states. So, and I know that that's been something that's been talked about of late regarding portability. Is there anything new on that issue?
Well, so there's been discussions of, I think the biggest item in that realm is multi-state compacts have gotten to be more popular. But I think that there's sort of some separate issues with that. I think when you start getting into the realm of multi-state compacts and allowing practitioners to practice in a number of states with one license, there are some technical issues to work out to make sure that the qualifications for licensure are close enough to your state's requirements that there wouldn't be any issues, and to make sure that someone is really abiding by the standards in your state. From a practicality standpoint, from an agency, we operate at a very careful balance. And so we have a number of individuals that hold a license who live here in Kansas, and we have also a number for individuals out of state who obtain a Kansas license. And so if we were to jump in on something too quickly without doing the correct analysis, we run the risk of losing a lot of out-of-state licensees. And if we don't have a way to make up for that revenue, it does create an imbalance, and it would draw down the funds in the fee fund, and we'd have to look at how we were going to make up that money. Some of the multi-state compacts allow for states to issue their own multi-state license at a higher rate than a traditional in-state only license. And that is a way that states can make up some of that cost. But it's tricky because for some individuals, there is a big push to create these compacts and really get into it. But there's these technical things that really need to be worked out and really, thought through. So there is one for professional counseling that is currently in discussions. 2 states currently have passed it. Georgia and Maryland, I believe there's another that if they haven't, they're close to it. And I think there's several more that are hearing it in front of their legislative bodies this year. But that's probably something important in that area.
I will take back to our board your desire to see best practices and the desire to have unified standards. I think it's definitely an important issue. Like you said, telehealth was all, it was just around the peripheral and being done. And then all at once it became something we all counted on. So I will take that back to the board as a priority to look at and to start getting, some unified practices. I also think it's great to look at how other professions are doing it. It's a great question. Yeah. Any other feedback or questions, comments you want me to take back to the board? Okay. Thank you for that. Any other questions about any of the other items that David covered in his summary? Okay, it looks like we are moving on to new business. We have 3 items of new business. Training for the board advisor and the advisory committee members. David, do you want to take that? We have a document. Here we go.
Yes, so you received an email from me last week, at the end of last week, that had some attachments, and I'll be using some of those. I'll be speaking from the documents, so we're not going to be going word for word through all of those, but I think one thing at the January board meeting is I asked the board, are you in favor of having some initial training for new members and refresher training for existing members? And the board was in favor of that. Last year, legal counsel for the board at the time, it was Janet Art from the Attorney General's office. She came to each of the advisory committee members and did a training that lasted about an hour and a half. And so that was a big commitment that she made. And it was very helpful training, but it was very extensive training. And so we now have another individual working with us from the Attorney General's office. So we were able to use the training document that she provided to us. And so I will go through and highlight some of the items in that document for you, as well as you have 3 other documents that I'll go through and highlight some items from those. I mentioned 2 of them earlier today. The previous board governance policy is now split into 2 different documents, an expectation of board members and also an advisory committee policy document. The board generally has had training for board members and training for advisory committee members at the same time. So I will try my best to highlight items that not only focus on responsibilities of board members, but also responsibility of advisory committee members, because there are some differences in these areas. So I think the first item that I'll talk to is the expectations of board members document. And so it's a document that's about 5 pages long. And this document says it was adopted by the board January 10th, 2022. Most of the provisions had been the board governance policy before this. First is that it clarifies this expectation of board members document. Any of the responsibilities that are listed here that would potentially be in conflict with anything in statute or regulation, this comes after that in terms of authority. The expectation of board members, it's the mission statement for the board, is the mission of the BSRB in accordance with the intent of the Kansas legislature is to protect and serve the consumers of mental health services and the professions that offer them through the issuance of licenses, resolution of complaints, and the creation of appropriate regulations accomplished through efficiency, fairness, and respect for all of those involved. And then the guiding principles for the board are outlined here. Primarily that persons in Kansas shall expect that licensed mental health professionals are qualified, competent, and professional. And there's some information here about individuals regulated by the BSRB shall expect equitable and fair treatment in relation to licensing activities and disciplinary processes and administrative regulations. And then the BSRB shall provide all services in a manner that is timely, cost efficient, courteous, and competent. And BSRB shall be guided and led by ethical principles, clear policies, progressive thinking, and strategic decision-making. And the BSRB shall respect the dignity and worth of all individuals. The next section outlines some services that are expected from the board and the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. It talks about the process that license applications and license renewals shall be conducted in a timely manner. It also indicates that we'll inform individuals about what the expectation of the agency is. It talks about taking disciplinary action, providing timely information to the public, and maintaining rules and regulations. The next section of that document outlines a code of conduct for board members, which includes topics like integrity, conflict of interest, as well as confidentiality. We'll get into those topics a little bit more in the document that was provided by legal counsel for the board. On page 3, it outlines the process for board meetings, and it indicates under page 3, section 4A, that the board's composition by statute is that there are 12 members of the board, and the board members are all appointed by the governor. There are 2 licensed psychologists, 2 individuals licensed to engage in the practice of social work, 1 professional counselor, 1 marriage and family therapist, 1 master's level psychologist, 1 licensed addiction counselor or licensed clinical addiction counselor, and 4 members of the board represent the general public. It's important to note here, it doesn't specify in this document, but in statute, it indicates that the way that a board member can be removed is through the governor's office. So the board does not have the authority to remove board members. The governor can remove board members for one of three reasons. It's malfeasance, misfeasance, and nonfeasance. And without getting too deep into the legal definitions of those terms, essentially, malfeasance is when you have a legal responsibility to do something, but you do something that you do a bad action, essentially, and it goes against what your legal responsibility is. In this case, as a board member, the governor can remove somebody for that action. Misfeasance basically is when someone has a responsibility and they do something that is a significant enough mistake that it calls into question they're violating their responsibilities that they've agreed to as a board member. And then nonfeasance is essentially not acting when they have a legal responsibility to do so. So determining those grounds is left up to the governor's office. It's like I said, they have the authority to appoint and also to remove. Meetings of the board are to take place every Monday or every other month on the second Monday of the month, unless the board determines otherwise. Generally, those start in January, so the next meeting would be in March, and then after that, it would be in May. And then right now, during the legislative session, the board has determined if there are any meetings that need to take place to consider bills, to give me direction to offer any testimony, then they can have additional meetings. And then right now, all meetings are being conducted over Zoom. There's some general information about how the meetings will go, as well as the authority of the chair and the vice chair. On page 4, it talks about emergency executive sessions that can be held. Also on page 4, under section 7, it does clarify some information here about the organizational structure of the agency, specifically the board and executive director relationship. So it does indicate the executive director will communicate any personnel issues that should be addressed by the board to the chair of the board. And then the chair of the board will present those items to the board, and the executive director will communicate to the staff the board wishes, intentions, and policies. And we do have a monthly staff meeting here at the BSRB. And when information is provided to me at the board meeting, I deliver that to the staff at those meetings. Or if it's more timely, I send out emails to the staff. There's information also on page 4 about delegation to the executive director. The executive director shall be the administrative head of the organization, serving at all times under the board. The executive director will be responsible for implementing and executing the policies and activities approved by the board, and he will assist in the development of an overall program and shall recommend policies and activities for consideration for the board. The executive director will have sole authority to employ, eliminate, and fix the duties and salaries of other employees or independent contractors of the organization, subject to policies, regulations, and limitations approved by the state of Kansas. And I can tell you all that when we do go to hire someone for the BSRB, we have to submit that to the governor's office through the Department of Administration, and we're not able to hire someone unless we have their approval, and they also sign off on whatever we propose to pay that individual as well. On section C on page 4, it indicates the executive director shall keep the board advised of BSRB activities by issuing a report to the board at each full board meeting, which summarizes pertinent information. And the executive director shall prepare the agenda for board meetings in consultation with the board chair. It notes the executive director shall prepare the agenda in consultation with the board chair for an annual board retreat, which will allow for the issues before the board that need in-depth consideration. And monitoring the executive director's performance, there is language in here that instructs the board to do an annual performance review of the executive director's work, and then to do that on an annual basis thereafter. So I thought I would start with outlining the board responsibilities, since we do have board members who serve in the advisory committees, but also, as you'll see in the advisory committee policy, there is some language that says the responsibilities that are given to board members should also be followed in certain cases by advisory committee members. So I'll move next to the second document. It's a short document, it's 2 pages, and it's titled Advisory Committee Policy. And this was also adopted by the board at the January board meeting, although a lot of this information was previously in the back of the board governance policy. However, there have been a number of updates, so I thought I'd give you all a refresher. For some of you that are new to the advisory committee, you might be hearing this for the first time. The purpose of the advisory committee is that it is a creation by the board, and it has the purpose of supporting the board and carrying out its mission to protect the public. Members serve at the pleasure of the board, and actions pertaining to informing, licensing, and disciplining of those persons regulated by the board are the methods for accomplishing that mission. The process is that an advisory committee fulfills its purpose by addressing issues referred to it by the board through the advisory committee chair or the executive director. A committee may suggest issues it believes the board should consider by referring those through the chair of the advisory committee. And when the latter occurs, the board has three options. The board can either agree the issue needs to be addressed at the board level. The board can agree the issue should be addressed and refer the matter to the appropriate person or committee for additional information, review, or analysis, which will then be brought back to the board, or the board can decide not to address the issue. And so I think, without going any further, this outlines the basic process for the advisory committees. The majority of the work the advisory committees will be doing is addressing recommendations that have either been forwarded by the board through the advisory committee chair or items brought to the advisory committee through the executive director. And then the advisory committee will consider these and can report back to the board any recommendations. But the advisory committee can also look at items itself and then send these recommendations through the chair of the advisory committee back to the board. And so the scope of the work of the advisory committee is somewhat limited, but it is an important role and it is very helpful for the board. All 7 of the professions under the advisory committee or under the board have an advisory committee, and those generally meet every other month, although one of the advisory committees currently meets quarterly. Under the structure of the committee, when we went through the review process for advisory committee members, we went through some of this information, but I'll highlight a couple things in that section because some of this did change in the recent January board meeting. So the document states that chairs of the advisory committees will be board members. If the profession is represented on the board, the chair of the advisory committee will be a board member licensed in the discipline of the committee and appointed by the governor to represent that discipline on the board. Currently, all of the professions have an individual on the board except for the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee. Any other board members appointed by the governor to represent that discipline on the board will serve as a member of that advisory committee. So currently, right now, we do have 2 professional members from licensed psychology and also social work. So it clarifies that the member who's not the chair of those committees would still be on those committees. And then a public member of the board will serve as a member of each of the advisory committee members. In terms of the advisory committee members that are not board members, there's a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 10 members appointed by the chair of the board. The executive director is a non-voting ex officio member. The assistant director or licensing manager is encouraged to attend these meetings, and the assistant attorney general representing the board should attend the meetings when their attendance is requested. And that is rare, but it does happen sometimes that we ask one of the legal counsel to come to the board or advisory committee member meetings to either clarify an item or sometimes to provide training like Janet Art did last year. The terms of the advisory committees are 2 years long. They can serve up to 4 terms, and they are appointed by the chair of the BSRB. Appointments to the committee should be staggered to avoid having too many members come up at the maximum length of service at the same time. And then the next phrase is the one that I had mentioned earlier. The policies and procedures under which the BSRB board members are expected to operate will apply also to the advisory committee members. So when you think about things in the context of confidentiality, conflicts of interest, integrity, and those kind of issues, just make sure that you apply those to the advisory committee members as you would to the board members in terms of expectations. It notes here that the chair of the BSRB can also remove members in addition to the previously said about appointing individuals. The board also did make a couple of changes in terms of how the language is structured in terms of who can serve on advisory committee members. It does indicate that anyone can be nominated. This past year, we opened it up and asked licensees to self-nominate if they wish to be considered for consideration. In reviewing nominations, the committee should work to ensure that there is diverse representation, including but not limited to geographic setting, gender, culture, and ethnicity. And members should provide representation of the levels of licensing for that discipline and those members should be selected from among the public and private practitioners and educators. And then the remainder of the document just goes into some of the mechanics about the actual process for determining who would be recommended as an advisory committee member. And it notes that would be forwarded to the chair for review and allow the chair of the board to get further input. It notes that those appointments to the advisory committee would have to be done at a meeting of the board. And then the person would be informed after they had been appointed to the board by the executive director. The next document I wanted to make you aware of is a new document, but it was created this past year and approved by the board at the January board meeting. It is titled Guidelines for Public Attendees of Meetings. And so most of the meetings of the BSRB fall under the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or COMA, which we'll get into a little bit more in the document from legal counsel. As such, they are open to the public. And so this meeting is currently being broadcast on the YouTube channel, and it'll be available for individuals to watch after the meeting. The Kansas Open Meeting Act does not require state agencies to provide public comment to individuals. However, as part of the BSRB's public protection mission, the agency values the receipt of information and input from members of the public. But to ensure that all individuals are treated in a consistent and respectful manner, the agency has created this guidance document to provide general procedures for individuals attending board meetings and advisory committee meetings, as well as the general guidance on topics relevant to public comment at these meetings. So this document goes into guidelines for individuals who are attending in-person meetings, and it mentions that those are generally held under normal situations at the board's office, and that we try to allow enough physical room for individuals to attend meetings in person. Right now, we are conducting all meetings virtually over Zoom, and we indicate here that individuals receive public access through being able to observe the YouTube channel, hear the meeting, and see what's going on. But if they are approved by the chair to provide public comment, they would get Zoom access information to attend the meeting, and then has some mechanics here as far as how to be recognized in the Zoom meeting and how to conduct themselves when they're on the Zoom call. And then it provides some general guidance in terms of making sure that electronic devices are shut off and things like that. Then it provides on page 2 the procedure for public comment. And so it notes that the chair of the board and the chair of the advisory committee will determine whether public comment will be allowed at each meeting. If time for public comment is permitted, the chair will have authority to determine the amount of time available for public comment. And then it outlines how individuals can request to submit public comment. And then it says that individuals are not required to submit written materials for public comment, but that it is valuable so that the board or the advisory committee knows what issues are going to be discussed and can better participate if there is a discussion by the advisory committee or board. And then at the end of that section, it does indicate what process we will follow if public comment is allowed. One thing that's important to note here is that at the conclusion of public comment, the board or the advisory committees at times has asked questions and continued the discussion, but should there be a situation to where the agenda is very tightly packed, the board or the advisory committee does not necessarily have to respond to the public comment. If you allow public comment, you could just move forward after the public comment and just allow individuals the opportunity to make that public comment. So, so just outlines some of the different options that could be followed depending upon the issue that's brought before the board or the advisory committees. And then a very important section is at the bottom of page 2. It outlines topics relevant for public comment, and it indicates that as a state agency by the Kansas legislature, the BSRB is governed by statutes and regulations. Information is presented to the board or advisory committee that should be relevant to those statutes or regulations governing the agency, and that the chair reserves the right to limit testimony that is in the judgment of the chair, not relevant to matters germane to the board or advisory committees. And common examples of past public comment topics included requested changes to the statutes or regulations relating to the qualifications for licensure, fees, continuing education, or unprofessional conduct of practitioners. It also includes some language here that says that it is very important for us to receive information about specific practitioners. If there are issues, the agency absolutely wants to receive that, but we have a standard practice for receiving information about complaints, or we call them reports of alleged violations, because they're reports of alleged violations of the statutes or regulations. And to ensure that we treat people fairly and can treat them in a consistent manner, we have to receive that information through the appropriate form, and then have our investigators review that, and then it is brought before the complaint review committee. So we wanted to clarify here that if there are individuals who have something that would relate more to the complaint process, we want them to know that we absolutely want to receive that information. We just need to make sure that we receive it in the appropriate method so that we can investigate it and following up to make sure that we are being fair to both the people who bring that forward and also the practitioners who might have that filed against them. So this is a brand new document. We previously did not have a document like this, but those first three documents I talked about, the expectations of board members, the advisory committee policy, and the guidelines for public attendees of meetings. Those are all posted on the BSRB website under our policies section. And those are available for anyone to review and ask us any questions about. Next, I'll move to the larger document. And this is a document that was provided by legal counsel for the board last year. It has the heading Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board, Board and Advisory Committee Members Orientation. And as you can see, it was provided last year by Janet Art, Assistant Attorney General, Legal Counsel for the board in February of 2021. I've had a chance to review the material in this document, and it is still current. But I wanted to highlight some of this because I feel like if you're not used to working on a board or being a member of an advisory committee for potentially a state agency, there might be some different rules that you may not be familiar with. But I feel like if you have heard this information, it's a good refresher. It's good to be reminded about certain requirements and certain procedures we have to follow. So I'll go through this document, and I've highlighted a few things that we need to cover. But if you do have any questions as we go through this, please feel free to go ahead and let me know, and I can kind of address those questions for you. First, we're going to move down to the main topic. Professional Licensing Board is a creature of statute. So we talked a little bit before about statutes and regulations. The state of Kansas regulates professions, and each of the professions is regulated by a licensing board or commission that was created by the Kansas legislature for the purpose of ensuring that licensing professionals are competent and do not pose a risk to the public. For the BSRB, we were created when the licensing body for licensed psychologists and social workers came together back in the 1980s. And since that time, the board has grown as other professions have come under the board. So a licensing board is created by enabling legislation, which establishes a board's form, mission, powers, functions, tools of implementation, and enforcement abilities. The statutes that are specific to a board provide the board's authority, and it is also limited by constitutional equal protection and due process rights. Those are prohibit a board from acting in a manner which results in disparate or inconsistent treatment of professionals or persons that are similarly situated. So not only are we required to follow the statutes, but we also have some constitutional guidelines. And if there are any federal statutes that would come over the state statutes, those would have precedence. On page 2, a licensing board may not impose more severe discipline, for example, on male licensees solely because of their gender, or a licensing board may not revoke a license simply because the board does not like that particular licensee. So this kind of goes to what I was talking about earlier. We have to treat people fairly, and we can't make rules that would be more restrictive on one person than another. In the next section, it mentions that the Kansas legislature retains control over certain aspects of a licensing board. The board must receive a legislative appropriation in order to expend the monies collected. So as I mentioned earlier, we are a fee-funded agency, but every year we come before the legislature and we indicate what our planned expenditures are. And our authority to spend money comes from our statutory approval by the legislature, where we may have funding in our fee fund, but each year in the appropriations bill, it will outline, here are the agencies in the state of Kansas, and then for each year, here is their expenditure limitation. And so for the BSRB, you would say for fiscal year 22, which we are currently in, they can expend no more than X amount of dollars. And then for fiscal year 23, you are limited to expending from the fee fund of this much amount of money. So one of the options, if the legislature is unhappy about something, they do have the ability to restrict that. And when they hear the budgets, they could add or decrease that limitation. It is more rare for fee-funded agencies than it would be for a state general fund agency, where they would receive money directly from the state, but it can happen. And sometimes it can happen with issues relating to how agencies are spending their money. So we try to spend it appropriately and be transparent about how we're spending the money. Down about the bottom of page 2, the general purpose, whether explicit or implied, of a licensing board is to secure for the people of Kansas the services of competent, trustworthy practitioners and to protect the public against unprofessional, unauthorized, and unqualified practitioners. The purpose of a licensing board is not to promote or protect the profession as a whole. Those functions typically lie with a private professional association. A licensing board accomplishes its purpose through licensing applicants who meet the established eligibility qualifications, generally education, experience, and an examination, and through the disciplinary process by which the license may be conditioned, limited, revoked, suspended, or otherwise sanctioned for the violation of a statute or regulation. Under the next section, functions and duties of a licensing board. In order to carry out its purpose, a board is granted or delegated powers and functions that are similar or parallel to the 3 branches of government. We do have a certain amount of what we would call executive authority, and that is that we have an enabling act, and then under the Kansas Open Meeting Act, we ensure that public business is conducted openly. Under the judicial authority, we do have the function to enforce the Enabling Act through a quasi-judicial hearing process and make findings of fact and conclusions of law and determining whether those facts prove to be a violation of the law has occurred. And then we have a somewhat legislative authority, and that is to adopt regulations in order to implement and interpret the Enabling Act with more specific requirements. And in adopting rules and regulations, a board is required to follow the Rules and Regulations Filing Act to ensure that we're going by those guidelines to do the rules and regulations. A little bit better understanding of statutes, regulations, and policies is found on page 3 in that next section. So in order to fulfill its responsibility to protect the public from incompetent, unprofessional, and unauthorized practitioners, a regulatory board implements and enforces statutes and regulations, and at times operates according to the internal policies. In order to be effective, board members need to understand the difference between statutes, regulations, and policies. So I'll go ahead and explain those briefly. Statutes are laws that are passed by the Kansas legislature through authority derived from the Kansas Constitution and subsequently signed by the governor. Statutes generally become effective on July 1st of that session year. They can become effective if a different date is specified in the legislation. An example of that would be the SIPAC Compact for licensed psychologists. It was passed, but its effective date was January 1st of 2022. So that is one that had a delayed implementation date. The bill that I mentioned earlier, Senate Bill 387, those would be items that if they were passed in bill form and the governor did sign that bill, it would be part of the statutes for the BSRB. On the other hand, regulations are adopted by a board to further implement or carry out the purpose of particular statutes. A board's authority to adopt regulation is derived from statute and adopting rules and regulations. A board is required to follow the Rules and Regulations Filing Act to ensure the process of adopting administrative regulations is open, receptive to the public, and legislative input, addresses the economic impact of board and those affected, and the regulations themselves are consistent in style, organization, grammar, are lawful, and are filed and published. And Leslie Allen in our office does a lot of work on this regulations, and those have to be drafted in a very specific way. And then we send those to be reviewed, and they come back with notes to make sure that they are consistent with the regulatory style and also any updates that need to be included in those. On page 4, I'm not going to go through the different items that have to be included in regulations, but you can see that in determining whether to adopt a regulation, you should look at certain factors, including the need for the regulation, and then do we have a statutory authority to actually adopt that regulation, and then the procedures to go about filing the regulation with the appropriate office. And I'll go ahead and if you would like to read that, you're welcome to do so, but I'll go ahead and move next to page 6. On page 6, there's a section that talks about effectiveness as a board member. So understanding that we have the general requirements as a board, as a public protection agency established by the Kansas legislature, and that our initial framework is the statutes, and then next is the regulations, and then third are any policies adopted by the agency, such as those expectations of board members, advisory committee policies. The question next is, how does one be an effective board member, or in this case, an advisory committee member? And I think some of the things in here really could apply to both. And so to be effective as a board member, it is recommended that you read the appropriate statutes and also the licensing acts. So you are all appointed as advisory committee members of the license counseling advisory committee member, or advisory committee. And following this meeting, I put together a list of all the statutes for that profession and all the regulations for that profession. And so I didn't want to send them to you in advance of the meeting because I thought that might be a little overwhelming. But after the meeting, I'll go ahead and send you a current copy of all of that so that you can peruse those as you have time. It is recommended that you read those acts and familiarize yourself with the language that is in them. And also so you can look to see if there are any items that might need to be reviewed or updated or any possible changes. Go ahead and read the statutes, the regulations. Those are posted on the BSRB's website, and you can always access them there. But like I said, I did put together a PDF of each that we can send to you. Be on the alert for agency policies and internal procedures which are inconsistent with or conflict with the board statutes and regulations, or which affect requirements for applicants or licensees. So for those items, we have a number of new policies with the board, the expectations of board members, the advisory committee policy, and also the guidance for public attendees. There were a number of changes that went into the process to get those documents, and it wouldn't surprise me if there needs to be some additional cleanup work at some time in the future. So if you do spot anything and you say these appear to be inconsistent, please let us know, or that would be a good conversation to maybe we could submit to the chair of the advisory committee and then consider having a discussion at a future advisory committee meeting. When you're looking through actions that the advisory committee or the board could take, it's important to do so on page 7 to ensure the decisions are within the authority granted. So there are some things that we may want to do or we may want to fix, but if it's not within our statutory or regulatory authority, we may be unable to go ahead and resolve those without having passed a bill or taken some other action. You must be willing to initiate action to amend statutes or modify regulations. As we continue this process and work more with the statutes and regulations, potentially you can get familiar with how to propose changes to those. Remember, the purpose of imposing discipline against licensees is to encourage compliance with the law and to protect the public. And always be mindful that the role of the board is to protect the public, not the licensee. The next section on page 7 involves conflicts of interest. So conflicts of interest typically mean having any interest, financial or otherwise, direct or indirect, or engaging in any business or transaction or professional activity, or incurring any obligation of any nature which is in substantial conflict with the proper discharge of the board members' duties in the public interest. Board members must make public and recuse themselves from any conflict of interest that exists to ensure the integrity of the board and all of its decisions. So there might be situations to where you need to announce that there could be a potential conflict of interest and then recuse yourself from a vote. And it does happen from time to time. Some just general types of public conflict, potential conflicts and external activities could be personal conflicts. It could be situations where it might involve the potential for personal gain. It could be something where someone has a bias based on a previous working relationship or other information you might know about an individual involved with a decision. Or on page 8, it could be the effects of a personal relationship. And so it gives some examples there. But it's important that when you think about the votes that you're making as a board member or an advisory committee member, just think about, could this be a possible conflict of interest, and do your best to identify when those situations happen and then recuse yourself from those votes. And I would say that it's more important to go ahead and do that and delay a vote than to go ahead and vote when you believe there might be a conflict of interest. So err on the side of making sure that you are cautious about the conflict of interest. On page 8, I'll talk a little bit more about the subject of confidentiality. So at all times, board members must conform to the rules of confidentiality and dealings outside of the boardroom, or in this case, outside of meetings. Protected information obtained in the capacity of a board member or advisory committee member must remain confidential during and after the membership on those committees. Termination of membership does not dissolve the member from responsibility to keep confidential information confidential. With that said, most of the information that we discussed is not confidential. Any information that's in a public meeting, anyone could go ahead and come back and watch the video and listen to everything that was said at this meeting. So the conversations in an open meeting are not confidential, but I'll identify some different times where the content could be confidential or when it is confidential. One instance where items discussed are confidential is, should we have an executive session during an open meeting? And the purpose of an executive session is to allow board members or advisory committee members to discuss certain matters privately outside of public view. And when you take an executive session, you have to be in an open meeting first, and then there has to be a proper motion that states the statutory ground for taking the executive session. And it has to explain why the executive session is taking place. There's some other technical rules that indicate about how long the executive session is going to last. But while you are in the executive session, the information that is discussed in that executive session should stay confidential. It is typically to discuss private information about an employee or to obtain advice from the board's attorney to preserve attorney-client privilege. It also could involve potential litigation. So that's another area that possibly would involve confidentiality. When you come back out of the executive session, it's very important not to disclose the information that was discussed in the executive session, because even though you return to the meeting, that's still considered to be confidential information. You are not able to vote in an executive session, but you can take a consensus. And if there is consensus in the executive session, you can return. And then what generally happens is you return from executive session, the meeting is open again, and then you can take votes or make motions and different things like that. Another item that was confidential is deliberations after a hearing. So discussions on a decision regarding a particular pending case are considered quasi-judicial deliberations. So the Kansas Open Meeting Act and the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, CAPA, allow board members to deliberate in private in order to reach a decision in a particular pending case involving the applicable law and sanctions. And it's understood that discussions during private deliberations are meant to be confidential. The next part talks about ex parte communication. Some of this is pretty legal, but so I won't go into depth about ex parte communication, but I think that the main instance where we see potential for that is that if there is a pending hearing before the board, we need to make sure I think that the main content is that in a spirit of fairness, we don't want to be receiving information directly from one party if it's not being heard by the other party. And it's important for the board members to receive all the necessary information at the same time. And so for that purpose, here at the office, if someone has requested a hearing on a decision, we have legal representation that represents the board, and we have the person representing themselves, or legal representation representing the person. And in preparations for the hearing, we have to receive things from both legal counsel and the applicant at the same time. So it's a little technical. You can read through the information on ex parte communication, but the general sense is that in certain procedures, it's very important that we make sure that we don't just have communications from one side. If you have any questions about that, feel free to let me know. But For the advisory committee, it generally should not come up very often, but it's included here primarily for board members, especially in relating to hearings. At the bottom of page 9, there's some information about professional activities. So a board member and an advisory committee member as well could potentially hold an office in a professional or trade association of the regulated profession, but may not lobby for or cast votes regarding a matter that would impact the professional association or the board member's office in that association. So one question that we do get from time to time, we have individuals who serve on the board of the advisory committee members that may be a member of a different association. And it's not a problem for you to be a member of the association, but you have to keep in mind your role. So your role as a board member is to protect the public. And you may have a different responsibility when you are working with that association, but it's important to make sure to separate out those two roles. And if you do hold an office as a member of that association, you need to be very careful about that to make sure that it doesn't come off even with the appearance that you could be advocating for that association in your position here with the board or with the advisory committee. A board member may not use his or her position on the board to further the interest of the professional association or his or her office in that association. Board members may attend professional conferences and social events, but they must be mindful of open meetings rules and conflicts of interest. If a majority of the board members are present, do not discuss the business or affairs of the board to avoid triggering a meeting under the Kansas Open Meeting Act. We'll get into a few more instances under that, but there are always a few questions about what could potentially constitute a violation under the Kansas Open Meeting Act. So I'll go ahead and I'll talk about that first, and then I'll try to clarify a few things as they apply to that. Also, before I move to the Kansas Open Meeting Act, under other conduct on page 10, a board member should not represent himself or herself as a spokesperson for the board unless authorized by vote of the board to speak on the board's behalf. If a board member is asked to give the board's position on an issue and the board has not authorized that member to do so, the board member must decline to comment or make clear that an opinion expressed are those of him or herself alone and not the board. A board member should not ask board staff or board counsel to provide legal advice or preferential treatment to any applicant or licensee. So the main part of this to take from this is that I mentioned earlier we have the board's bill, Senate Bill 387, which is going to be heard in the committee later this week. Any individuals can provide testimony in support or against whichever bill that they would prefer. But if you are a member of the board or a member of the advisory committee, it's important that you note in your testimony, should you do so, that your position is not the official position of the board or the advisory committee. You can note that you serve on the advisory committee, that's fine. You just want to make it very clear that you're not speaking for the board or for the advisory committee. The board at the January meeting, indicated to me that I have the ability to go ahead and provide testimony on behalf of the board as I am the director of the agency. So you just need to make it clear. And if someone asks you the board's position on something, it's okay to give factual information about actions the board has taken. But if they say, how would the board feel about this? You want to be careful to not say, well, the board feels this way, or maybe the board would do this, because that really needs to be something addressed in a meeting of the advisory committee or the board. In terms of the Kansas Open Meeting Act, KOMA, the Kansas Open Meeting Act allows the public to observe governmental entities making decisions, and according to statute, meetings shall be open to the public because a representative government is dependent upon an informed electorate. KOMA applies to all legislative and administrative bodies and agencies of the state and political and taxing subdivisions thereof, and any subordinate groups thereof receiving or expending and supporting in whole or in part public funds. It does not define the term subordinate group, but if created by a covered entity or the group has become an extension of the covered entity, most likely the subordinate group is subject to the KOMA. So the important thing to know is that KOMA does apply to most meetings of the board, and it applies to most meetings of the advisory committee as well. So most of our meetings are going to be open unless there's a reason that those would not be. The KOMA does not apply to an otherwise covered entity when exercising a quasi-judicial function or conducting a proceeding or hearing under the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, or the CAPA. KOMA also does not apply to the judiciary, private organizations, and staff meetings of a covered entity. And then it defines there what a meeting officially is, Any gathering or assembly in person through use of telephone or any other medium for interactive communication by a majority of the members of an agency or public body subject to the act for purposes of discussing the business or affairs of the public body. So basically, the thing to take from this is that right now there are 9 members of the advisory committee for the licensed professional counseling advisory committee. And so what you want to make sure is that it's not a problem for you to reach out to the chair with a question or an issue. And you are welcome to speak between yourselves. Where you want to be careful is that should there be a conversation, even if it's at a casual setting, where there happens to be 5 members of the advisory committee or more, and you find yourself talking about advisory committee business, that could constitute a meeting, even though you're not in an official place. But if it constitutes a majority of the members of the committee, and you are talking about the committee work, then that could be perceived as a meeting, and you want to avoid that because those have to be open to the public. So if you are involved in many of the same associations, it could potentially be where you would have multiple people. Now, if it's at a social interaction and you're not talking about board work or advisory committee work, then that's fine. You just got to be careful about that. It mentions here that the open meeting aspect also applies to things like retreats and work sessions. So it doesn't have to be just an official meeting. And then it talks about the calculation for the majority of members of the board. So really it's 1/2. So when we have 9, it's 5. A discussion does not require binding action or voting. Discussion can occur at social gatherings, retreats, etc. On page 11, the presiding officer has a duty to provide notice of the meeting, but this can be delegated. So we do provide notice of all of the advisory committee meetings and the board meetings. We post those on the board's website, even though it's not required. But we also post them through the public square in the state of Kansas. So individuals have the opportunity to find out about the meetings. According to the statute, individuals must request notice of meetings to officially fall under the statutory provision, but we provide it out there in case anyone wants to go back and listen or listen during the meeting. It also talks about procedure in terms of how the meetings should be done. The COMA does not require any specific procedures such as Robert's Rules of Order. So we have a flexible way of handling business, usually at the discretion of the chairs of the board or the advisory committees. It also doesn't require for the creation of an agenda, but it says if you do create one, you have to make it available. You can't have secret votes in meetings under COMA. And then there's some other information here about minutes and about executive sessions. And what usually would fall under those executive sessions we've talked about previously: consultation with the board's legal counsel or information about employment or individuals that are employees in those discussions. On page 12, it talks about should there be any issues with the Kansas Open Meeting Act. If there are complaints, those would be civil nature and not criminal. And essentially someone would file a complaint and then it would be up to the Attorney General's office to investigate that and determine if a violation had occurred. And then there's some information there on page 12 about that, and page 13 as well. So we will do our best to provide guidance for you on open meetings. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. One other item about open meetings too that I feel like I have to mention is that there is such a thing called a chain communication that you need to be wary of too. So you don't want to involve the majority of members of a committee. Most people see it pretty clearly if you're all in the same area and you're all talking about something at the same time. But if one member were to forward something to another member and another member were to forward something to another member, if that continued to where it involved the majority of the members of the committee and there was discussion back and forth on it, that would constitute a meeting. So you may have only forwarded it to one person, but if they continue to forward it, then you need to be careful about that. Now, as staff of the BSRB, we are able to work with any individuals. So never feel like you have any issues in terms of contacting me with any questions. But I want to make sure that you're aware of any potential issues with the Open Meetings Act. Page 13 addresses the Kansas Open Records Act, or KORA. And so by statute, it requires the board to have its records open for inspection by any person unless otherwise provided. And it should be liberally construed and applied to promote such policy. So a public agency includes the state or any political or taxing subdivision. In this case, it does apply to the BSRB. On page 14, it identifies what records would fall under potentially a Kansas open records request. And that could it could involve a lot of records, which you might not normally think of. But it would basically be any recorded information, regardless of the form or characteristic, which is made, maintained, or kept in the possession of any public agency, and written records, photographs, computer data, or emails. Public record does not include records that are owned by a private person or entity that are not related to functions, activities, programs, or operations funded by public funds, or records not in existence at the time of the request. It talks about some procedures that we have to follow in terms of any open records requests that we receive. But the important thing I think to take from this is that individuals could do an open records request for any information on a certain topic, and that unless any of that information is confidential, we would have to provide that information. Now, it does have some information here in the training that says that we can go ahead and do an estimate on what it would cost for us to produce that information. And there is certain information that is confidential, for example, things like social security numbers, at times, certain address information, certain medical history, things like that. But a lot of that information is still, other information is still public. So things like text messages, things like emails. So you want to be cautious about how you phrase things in emails, because those are potentially records that could be seen at a later date. So just something to think about when you are sending communication back and forth with members, and also with the agent, us here, the BSRB. And then it kind of goes into some more information here about the process that we would follow to go ahead and provide those records. Under CORA on page 14, there's a presumption of openness. As such, the requested public records must be released unless an exemption to disclose applies. The burden rests on the board to prove the requested records are exempt from disclosure. And then exemptions to disclosure may be discretionary or mandatory. And then it talks about some discretionary closure, and it lists some items that might fall under the discretionary closure that we could potentially not provide those records based on those topics. On page 15, it says the board may recover only actual cost to provide the requested records. Those costs include staff time to retrieve and review the records, redact information from a record, and copy the record. The fees may be estimated and collected before the records are provided. And then should there be any violation, it's a civil act, not a criminal act. And so it outlines the procedures there. On page 15, it says effective July 1st, 2015, the core provisions also authorize the Attorney General to enter into a consent order or issue a finding of a violation after an investigation shows by preponderance the evidence that a violation has occurred. But basically, when we receive an open records request, we have a 3-day window to respond to it. And then we have a certain amount of time that we have to get the records and to send those out. But for your purposes, just keep in mind that most of the communications and most of the records here at the BSRB might be subject to an open records request should we receive one, and we would take the appropriate steps to redact those. But when you communicate with our office, just keep in mind that there's a lot of things that may not be thought of as a traditional record, but they are still a record, and a lot of them would fall under the Kansas Open Records Act if a proper request was made. On page 16, the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, or CAPA, it creates a procedural right and imposes procedural duties. The general rules that licensing boards like the BSRB must do business in an open meeting under the COMA, unless directed by statute to conduct the proceeding or hearing pursuant to CAPA. And so we have the Kansas Open Meeting Act, which applies to most of the meetings and work of the board. But the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act is a separate act, and certain requirements are different. So under most CAPA meetings, these would not be public meetings, and the information that is discussed at these meetings would be different, and I'll explain a little bit why. So under CAPA, the key conclusion of this opinion is that when a licensing board statutes provide that the CAPA applies, the board shall follow the CAPA and not COMA. CAPA sets out procedure to follow the board is deciding what to do in cases involving individual licensees, much like the procedure that is followed in court cases. So when we are, when the statutes say that the discussion for a particular licensee will be reviewed, we will go ahead and get that information, and it'll be brought to the board under a CAPA session. And then the board will have a chance to review that in a confidential meeting, and then they can issue a decision after that. Other than the Behavior Analyst Licensure Act, each of the board's licensing act outlines when CAPA can be followed. And then even the Behavior Analyst one talks about CAPA, but in a little bit different language. Under the CAPA, neither the public or an applicant has to be notified when the board meets or considers an application for licensure. Similarly, under CAPA, neither the public or licensee has to be notified when the Complaint Review Committee meets to consider whether probable cause exists in a discipline case or issues a summary proceeding order. Additionally, the board and the CRC do not need to take a vote in public for decisions to be made under CAPA. Under CAPA, decisions are made when a licensee or an order is issued. The necessary board staff and board of the CRC's attorney can be present during the CAPA discussion to make sure the board's members have the information or legal advice they need to make an informed decision. So for your purposes, we probably won't have too many items come before the advisory committee that will involve CAPA, but under the board, the main two things are consideration of individual licensure applicants, and more of that can be found on page 18, or also investigations under the Complaint Review Committee, and part of that can be found on page 18 as well. There's some additional information about appointing and providing officers and information about hearings. Since that doesn't affect the majority of the members of the advisory committee, I'm going to go ahead and move past that, but go ahead and read that as you would like. One item I just want to mention here, just to conclude the training, is on page 21. There's a note about the Kansas Tort Claims Act. So the Kansas Tort Claims Act generally governs the liability of the state of Kansas and its agencies and employees. An employee includes a member of the board or committee of a governmental entity, including elected or appointed officials and persons acting on behalf or in the service of a governmental entity in any official capacity, whether with or without compensation. The basic rule of the Kansas Tort Claims Act is vicarious liability for any actionable wrongful act or omissions of government employees within the scope of their employment, subject to affirmative grants of immunity that may exist on a case-by-case basis. So this applies primarily to staff of the BSRB and also for board members. But the thing to take from this is that if you are sued for an act that occurred within the scope of their duties as a board member, they are entitled to have the Attorney General's office defend them at no cost, provided that they make a timely request for that representation, that they did was within the context of their duties as a board member or as a staff member, and that they were following the guidance from legal counsel. It shouldn't really affect too many of the advisory committee members, but it's something very important for the board members to be aware of. And so I understand that training was lengthy and we covered a lot of material, but I want to say that, all these are really important. Feel free to read them in more detail as time allows. But if you do have any questions about any of those items, feel free to reach out and let me know. And if you have any questions right now, I'm open for any questions as well.
Thank you so much, David, for that training. Okay, any questions or feedback? So two things I'd like to reiterate. Three. First, thank you so much for taking the time to prepare these documents, send them to us, and frame them. I can't say how valuable it is I can't stress how valuable it is to read them and the statutes and regs that David's going to send over. I read them on planes. I always think, okay, I've got 3 hours to sit here and focus, and it's so handy to get updated copies and really read what's there. And I will say that, as we talk about our work for the year and getting together subcommittees, whatever we decide to do, I will always run by David, what are appropriate conversations to have and what is outside the lines. So don't hesitate as we're doing our work to reach out to staff, because they will be happy to give us guidelines about what we can do and what we can't do. Any other questions or feedback before we move on? Okay. So, David, which one would you like to do next? Discussion of committee work for the year or unprofessional conduct regs? Do you have a preference?
Well, how about if we move to the unprofessional conduct regulations? Because I think that conversation can be real short, and then we can take however much time you would like for the last topic then.
Okay, go for it.
Okay. So an item on here, it was under new business, item C, was discussion on unprofessional conduct regulations. And basically what I'm asking each of the advisory committee members to do for each of the different advisory committees is to look at the current language in the unprofessional conduct regulation for your profession. So that was also sent out to you at the end of last week. It's a 4-page document, but it has about 56 different items that are listed here under the unprofessional conduct regulation. And as sort of a homework item, if you don't mind, I would appreciate if you guys could read through this unprofessional conduct regulation and keep in mind just some things to think about when you're looking at that between now and the next advisory committee meeting. Is the terminology still good? You know, I don't know how recently some of these terms were updated, and are all the things that we talk about in these unprofessional conducts, are those applicable to the way that things operate now, especially with methods such as telework and other things. So I wanted to just provide this to you and ask that between now and the next meeting, if you could read these and come back, and if you have any suggestions or recommendations on things for the advisory committee to discuss, I thought that would be really helpful. I'm asking each of the different advisory committees to do that with their unprofessional conduct regulations.
Dave, do you want me to also email the committee the one that they had worked on previously?
So I'm sending out a copy of all the statutes and regulations separately. Is this a different document that maybe the advisory committee had worked on in the past?
Yes, this would be the one they had, the one that Todd had his students work on. And so it has changes already, so it would just be amending any other changes that they had.
Okay, sure. I think that would probably be helpful for people to get to. But.
Okay.
Thank you for that. Yes, that'll be very helpful.
And that's all that I have on that topic. I just kind of wanted to highlight it and ask if the members could look at it for the next meeting.
Terrific.
And not to say that has to be a one-time thing. You know, some of these conversations might last, but my hope is that, my goal is that all of the regulations for the different professions can continue to be reviewed by the advisory committees so that we can be current in all of our language. And if anyone were to ever accuse us of having outdated regulations or that we never look at them, I can go before a committee and say, I know completely that the advisory committees do a great job of looking through these and making sure that we're updated. So.
Terrific. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, that's a lot of homework. Homework for all the professors on the committee. Okay, so discussion of committee work for the upcoming year. I'd like to start that conversation. I feel like, giving it 12 minutes is, probably not enough time. So let's start that conversation and know that that can be an ongoing conversation that can roll over, especially as we, when you're reading statutes and regs and, documents, you're going to come up with great ideas for what we need to do this year. So let's start with what we know and know that it is an ongoing conversation. So David, do you want to start that conversation with some of the things we talked about, or would you like me to do it?
You can go ahead and start if you want.
Okay. So one of the things that we talked about was reviewing the regulations in general for updates in language, or not the regulations. Well, did we say statutes and regs or both? I don't remember which one we said.
Both. Yep.
Both. For updating language, making sure language is more modern, up to date, that their regulations and statutes that are really outdated can go away. We just want to really show that we're up to date, paying attention. We're not just leaving things lingering that aren't relevant anymore, updating things that need to be updated. That's a big task. As you read the statutes and regs, you'll see certain things that aren't relevant, certain things that need to be updated for language. So David, what do you think is a good process for doing that? Do you have a recommendation?
I think, we'll be sending out all of the statutes and regulations after the meeting. So I think starting with the rules of unprofessional conduct is probably the first place to start. And then having the other ones to resource to read as time allows. But starting with unprofessional conduct, I think is a good place to start.
Okay. I like the idea of keeping it to one topic, because the process will evolve out of that. as we learn to do that well, hopefully that process can be applied as we look at other areas. Does anybody have any ideas or feedback about that? Okay. Any other new business, David, you can think of that we discussed? I think you've covered most of it.
Yeah, so last year, there was a fair amount of time that was talked, the committee spent some time talking about the compact. And I do think as other states go through their legislative sessions and there's more discussion on the compact, maybe that's something that the advisory committee could revisit. Previously, there was only a couple states that had passed it, so there was a limited amount of public feedback from the states on it. But as it goes through more states, we'll be able to look at that again. So that could be something for the advisory committee to look at again.
Right. I know one concern we had was that so far as part of the compacted, a master's degree was not required in some of the states. I think it was Georgia, and was it North Carolina? That they did not have a master's degree required.
I don't recall, but that could be.
Yeah, I remember that being one concern that just really felt like a roadblock, but that's just one thing.
Georgia do
So-
require a master.
Say again, I'm sorry.
Georgia do require a master. Georgia do require a master.
So Georgia does require a master's. Okay. I did not know. I knew one did and one didn't, but I didn't know it was Georgia that required it. So Adil, have you been following the compact and the progress?
Yes, I was part of the ACA Governor Council who approved the compact.
Great.
I was in the mix. I know the ACA spent a lot of money on pushing this. So
Well, good. Be sure and speak up when those conversations come to the advisory committee. Make sure that you're really, informing us of what you know and what the progress is that you're aware of.
I've been waiting for this for 35 years.
Been paying attention for a while. Okay, terrific. Any other current work you'd like to see? Anybody have any ideas that we can start to think about for work this year? Okay. Well, excuse me. I am sure you'll have ideas after looking at some of the documents that are in front of you now. I know things always come up. So I'm looking forward to hearing about all of that next time. And of course, you can contact us in between so that we can really start doing research and thinking about, what we need to do. Any other feedback about that before we move on to adjournment? David and Leslie, do you have anything?
No. So we had on the schedule that the next meeting would be Monday, April 4th. So the only thing before adjourning is just wanted to confirm that would still be a good date for everyone.
Does that work? Does that not work for anybody that's present? Okay. So I guess we'll see you then. And do we need a motion for adjournment, David?
Yeah, it's usually best to go ahead and do it that way. So
Okay, I need a motion for adjournment.
I move we adjourn.
Thank you, Kenton. Second?
Second.
Thank you so much. Okay, anybody, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Okay. We'll keep warm, everybody, and we'll see you in spring.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
everyone.
much for your time. Thank you.
Mhm.
Bye now.
Bye.